3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country...
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
All action.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
The U.S. Customs and Border Protection website contains a lot of really interesting information, including an interactive graph of the number of migrant encounters on the southern border over time. Since 2022, the number of migrant encounters has been well over 200,000 per month, peaking as high as 300,000 in December of 2023. The data is current up until February of this year. The number of border encounters in that month, just under 12,000. It's clear that the Trump administration's commitment to securing the southern border is working. But the question now is, how do we keep it working? What changes need to be made to the immigration system to keep us from heading back to the uncontrolled illegal immigration of the Biden years? One critical component, argues heritage immigration expert Lora Ries, is the reform of the asylum system, ensuring that people who are genuinely in danger have access while discouraging fraudulent claims. Here's Lora to talk about that issue. Lora Ries, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Well, thanks for having me on again.
Today we want to talk about the asylum system here in the United States. And, it does seem awful mean of you to want to restrict asylum seekers coming to the United States.
Well, actually, we're trying to get back to the original intent of asylum, which is protecting people who either faced past persecution or face a well-founded fear of future persecution on account of enumerated grounds in the statute, whether that's their race, their religion, their nationality, their political opinion. Those were the original grounds for asylum post-World War II. And many of this system, much of the system was created for the U.S. and really the world post-World War II. So the classical example was, Jews fleeing the Holocaust. And yet, over the decades, we have gotten far afield from the traditional sense of asylum to the point where now it's really been watered down to be just another way to get into the U.S., into other countries around the world, and to the point where it's also being weaponized for mass migration. And really, sovereign nations like the U.S. are losing their say in who can come here, in what number, on what basis, and how long they can stay.
So what does it actually take for someone to enter the United States as an asylum seeker? What is the bar that they have to clear?
Well, it's pretty low. Currently in the statute, someone can, if they're coming via land, they can either go to a port of entry or even cross between ports of entry, which is illegal for immigration purposes, and say a few words of fear, which they're often coached to do. And then Border Patrol turns them over to an asylum officer to do a very minimal, low threshold, credible fear interview, most of which, most people clear that hurdle. And then they go on to apply for asylum, which is a higher standard. And yet, because they're released into the U.S. in most cases, and an asylum applicant can also apply for work authorization, it's a built-in recipe for fraud. It is truly a low-risk, high-reward benefit, and that's why so many people exploit it.
Is there really any repercussion for, let's say, a migrant who comes to the United States for economic purposes? They want to be able to work. They show up at the border. They say they have a fear of being persecuted in their home country, and therefore they're a refugee. But if they are misrepresenting themselves, is there some sort of repercussion that they can expect? Is there any cost associated with that?
Unfortunately, detecting fraud is kind of in the minority because asylum officers and immigration judges who hear these cases often hear the same types of stories over and over and over based on, what country the person's coming from. It largely comes down to credibility. Do I believe you? Do I believe the story you're telling me? Because the U.S. government doesn't have resources to go run down these claims in the person's home country to verify, yes, this did in fact happen to that person. And so if someone appears credible, then they are likely to have the benefit granted. But even if it is denied, the alien can then appeal it to an immigration judge. If it's denied there, they can appeal it to the Board of Immigration Appeals. All of this takes years, which is exactly what the alien wants. More time here in the U.S. to work here, to send money home, and then to either bring family here or have children here, buying themselves more time until they're eligible for a different type of an immigration benefit. And oftentimes then they'll abandon the asylum claim and say, well, now you have to give me a green card because I'm eligible due to marriage or some other avenue.
So there are some who might listen to this conversation and say, well, you're not giving people the benefit of the doubt. You're assuming these things about their condition. What reason do we have to believe that a great number of these claims are not truly asylum claims?
Well, pre the Biden administration, the denial rate, whether that was at DHS or the Justice Department in the immigration court system, the denial rate was pretty high. It was about 85% denials. And so people just weren't proving their cases. That changed during the Biden administration because they changed a number of procedural and jurisdiction maneuvers to get that grant rate higher. And that is, in fact, what they did. Now, under the Trump administration, they will undo that manipulation that the Biden administration did. Also, if someone is crossing illegally between the ports, they're supposed to be detained even during their asylum applications. The Biden administration wasn't doing that. The Trump administration will do more of that. And so, again, if there are a lot of loopholes that can be exploited, and you have to also have to consider the number of cases. So USCIS is overwhelmed with about 9.4 million cases right now total. Those aren't all asylum. And the court system has about 3.7 million cases in its backlog. And so the larger the backlog, the more overwhelmed the adjudicators are, the less time they can devote to each individual case, the easier it is to defraud, frankly.
This week, yourself and colleague Simon Hankinson here at the Heritage Foundation published a paper talking about reforming Asylum, the asylum system. Can you talk about some of the key points of that? What do you suggest to deal with this?
Yeah, so what the U.S. has been facing is not unique. Other parts of the globe have been facing the same situation where asylum is being weaponized for mass migration, whether that's different countries in Europe, whether that is the United Kingdom, whether it is Australia. And what countries have tried and faced, some successfully, some unsuccessfully, is can you take away the advantage to someone who shows up on your shore, in the case of the United Kingdom or Australia, illegally, by sending them to a third country to await their asylum case. We carried that out under the first Trump administration with the Remain in Mexico program. And what it does is if you are not giving the illegal alien the opportunity to get into their desired country and then disappear, but rather go to another country to pursue their asylum case, and many times people won't come. They won't try. They'll go home if that is what they are forced to do. And so it is a good anti-fraud measure. But really, it needs to be about the sovereign country to say, who can come, how many can come. We need to have an orderly and a manageable immigration system year by year. And right now, given the backlogs I talked about earlier and the millions of cases, we do not have a manageable immigration system. It's one of the reasons President Trump, as soon as he took office, signed an executive order suspending our refugee program until we get back to it being in the national interest, because we have so many other issues to deal with in terms of securing the border, interior enforcement, and those backlogs we are already facing. And so what the U.S. has found and what European countries have found is if you can require asylum applicants to apply in the first safe country in which they land, then they can get safety. They can be safe if they are truly fleeing persecution, and they aren't able to asylum shop or country shop to their desired country. And so you are spreading out the responsibility, the burden that receiving countries experience, and yet you can still provide protection for those who are truly in need of it.
I also wanted to ask you about something that happened over this past week. Elon Musk was doing an event in Wisconsin, and he mentioned that as part of the work of DOGE, they have discovered that folks who are applying for asylum are receiving Social Security numbers and potentially other government benefits. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so Elon Musk was on stage with one of his DOGE teammates, Antonio Gracias, and they put a chart up that showed new Social Security numbers issued to non-citizens. And they talked about if someone gets asylum, they can get work authorization, and then they automatically get a Social Security number in the mail without having to prove their identity and without having to do an in-person interview with the Social Security Administration. But it's actually worse than what they described, because the regulations currently allow someone to apply for work authorization 5 months after applying for asylum. So that clock doesn't start once asylum is granted. It starts once someone files an asylum application. And so it is in the interest of illegal aliens to file bogus asylum applications because it gets them that work card, and that's what they really want. So what we propose is that getting work authorization should be tied to being granted asylum or an other underlying benefit, rather than just encouraging people to submit applications to start a clock towards work authorization. And then, of course, the fact that Social Security Administration is just issuing these numbers sight unseen is a real problem. That needs to be fixed as well. But then Elon Musk and Gracias went on to talk about how these new issued numbers, Social Security numbers, and we're talking, they jumped up to near 2 million in fiscal year 24. They found that a subset of those were already receiving Medicaid and had voted illegally in the U.S. So it is quite a pipeline from simply submitting an asylum application to all these downstream benefits that can be exploited.
Lora Ries, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on again.
Thank you to Lora Ries for her contribution to today's episode. You can find Lora on X at Lora_Ries. That's Lora, LORA_Ries, RIES. You can find her report entitled "The U.S. Must Redesign Asylum Law for 21st Century Reality and Put America First," co-written with heritage expert Simon Hankinson at heritage.org. We'll include a link in the show notes. And thanks, as always, to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Ghani, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.